Good morning. I'm dealing with the topic of Sri Aurobindo as a short story writer. This talk is part of the series called Sri Aurobindo Eternity's Delegate, which deals with various aspects of Sri Aurobindo. I'm extremely grateful to Sakar and Dr. Reddy for giving me this opportunity to deal with this particular aspect of Sri Aurobindo. Now I will move on to my talk. The literary genre and thematic ambit of the short story includes legends, fairy or mythic tales, fables, and so on. This suggests that there is an element of the incredible in the short story that cannot be empirically tested. This aspect of the incredible has been dealt with by Sri Aurobindo via the occult and spiritual dimensions in the collection called Occult Idols and Jagannatha Rath. Occult Idols includes 4 short stories, namely The Phantom Hour, The Door at Abelar, The Devil's Mastiff, and The Golden Bird. Between 1885 and 1888, Sri Aurobindo visited St. Bees, Beswick, Auchinleck, Thirlmere, Galway in England. These locations might have inspired him to pen 3 of his short stories in England. These short stories are The Door at Abelar, The Devil's Mastiff, and The Phantom Hour. One common aspect of these 5 short stories is that they have been penned in Pondicherry, the cave of his tapasya, where he practiced yoga and grew in consciousness. Sri Aurobindo mentioned that since setting foot in Apollo Bandar in Mumbai, he began to have spiritual experiences. I quote, "At the same time, I found myself entering supraphysical worlds and planes with influences and an effect from them upon the material plane." I unquote. It can be assumed that the years during which he wrote the short stories, that is between 1910 to 1914, were the same years when he began to practice yoga in Pondicherry and attain the 7 siddhis known as Sapta Chatushtaya. One effect of attaining the siddhis was that he meditated while walking in Pondicherry. He called these supreme faculties. So the effect of these supreme faculties were manifested upon the material plane in the form of the Arya and the short story. Now, as you all know, Sri Aurobindo wrote the Arya between 1914 and to 1921, and in this monthly periodical of 64 pages, most of Sri Aurobindo's works were consecutively published for 7 years. Between January 28, 1911 and February 17, 1911, he had experiences of communication, vision of other worlds, drishti, prophecy, and various other siddhis. Experiences of Trikala Drishti are noted in Record of the Yoga in the sections called Record of Drishti and Record of Ideal Cognitions. Sri Aurobindo defines Trikala Drishti as a special faculty of jnana, I quote, by which that general power is applied to the actuality of things, the details of event, tendency, etc. in the past, present, and future of the world as it exists, has existed, and will exist in time. I unquote. According to Sri Aurobindo, Trikala Drishti works in 4 ways, namely by Drishti, Shruti, and Smriti, by dwelling in concentration on a particular object, by using this particular object as a means of some external sign or science, and finally by telepathy. On January 13, 1911, Sri Aurobindo had the vision, I quote, of 2 small birds on a branch on the wall, Chaya, seen sometime afterwards in life on the tree in the next garden, I unquote. The golden bird in the collection of occult idols can be interpreted to be the creative product of this vision that Sri Aurobindo had on January 30, 1911. This particular short story is set in the imaginary idyllic forests of Assam. The 2 characters are the golden bird and Luila. The story goes as Luila is a frequent visitor in the forests of Assam. She restricts her daily visitations to the close flowery wall of the forest because she is afraid of the brambles and thickets. But at the same time, her mind is described as a many-hued butterfly which wants to explore the hidden secrets of the forest. So one day, the golden bird comes out of the thickets and tries to woo her into the heart of the forest through its song. Unfortunately, the story ends here and we do not know exactly what the conclusion is. Even though Luila has a high respect for her radiant beauty, her mind strays like a many-hued butterfly. Now, this comparative premise brings to light the two parts of her being, the physical body versus her mind. The mother observes in Words of the Mother, I quote, "The divine manifests in the psychic as love, in the mind as knowledge, in the vital as power, and in the physical as beauty," I unquote. Clearly, Luila was aware of her radiant beauty, which desists her from braving the thorns to go explore the heartland of the forest. And at the same time, her mind is like a many-hued butterfly. This shows beyond doubt the complex nature of Luila's being and how each part of her being wants a particular fulfillment based on its svabhava, as explained earlier by the mother. This apparent dichotomy between her fear to brave the brambles and to want to know the hidden secrets of forest is removed by the golden bird. In the Aurobindonian context, the bird represents the psychic being. This means that Luila has a glimpse of her psychic being in the form of the golden bird, which is able to help her experience the various parts of her being as one complete entity. Since Luila is able to see and hear the golden bird and its song, she possesses the faculties of drishti and shruti. The bird conveys to her the secrets of the forest through its song. Now, Luila has the capacity to understand its song because the song is sung to her it's not expressed in a human language. And the forests of Assam can be interpreted as the unknown and uncharted levels of Luila's being. So it can be assumed that the bird telepathically transmits to Luila the knowledge of her psychic being and the various levels of her parts of her being without any physical interaction through any senses. Therefore, Luila possesses Trikala Drishti to interact with her psychic being. According to Sri Aurobindo, Trikala Drishti can be passive or dynamic. Passive Trikala Drishti can be defined as knowing the past, present and future without altering them. And dynamic Trikala Drishti can be explained as the power to learn of the past, present and future and having the capacity to alter them. In The Devil's Mastiff and The Door at Abelar, the protagonists Patrick Curran and the character Richard Lancaster possess the passive Trikala Drishti. In The Phantom Hour, Sturge Maynard possesses the dynamic Trikala Drishti. These characters also represent Sri Aurobindo's evolution of consciousness, that is from possessing passive Trikala Drishti to mastering dynamic Trikala Drishti. The first short story of our analysis is The Devil's Mastiff, which is set in an undisclosed rural location in England on a December day. The story has a historical relevance because it is set in the 17th century England during the Puritan regime when Oliver Cromwell usurped the throne of Crown King of England, Charles I. And he became Lord Protector and ruled England from 1653 to 1658. Patrick Curran is a royalist and therefore he is doomed to the gallows by Oliver Cromwell. Now, the fall from social and political grace led him to lose the love of his life, Lady Alicia Neville, to a Cromwell supporter called Colonel Luke Walter. While recalling the past events, Curran wonders that he would gladly take the devil's help to change the course of his fate. The very next minute, a manly apparition accosts him. The shadow introduces itself as a fugitive. Curran remains silent and he continues to think to himself, I quote, I would gladly offer my soul and the rest of my allotted days as a free gift to Satan if I might once clasp Alicia in my arms and take with me into hell the warm sense of the joy of her body, and if I might see Luke Walter dead before me, or be sure he was following me. Oh, if I can once be sure of that, let the brown dog of the Dacres leap on me the next moment, I care not, I unquote. The shadow immediately picks up on Curran's desire for revenge and promises its delivery that very evening. The shadow tells him that Lady Alicia Neville is getting married or is about to get married to Colonel Luke Walter at the Church of Wandle that very evening. So, if Curran wants, he can go seek his revenge. So, Curran is definitely startled by the shadow's ability to read his mind, that he wants revenge, and to know that he can seek revenge with the help of this particular shadow. So, Curran believes him to be the devil himself. Now Curran, I have to mention here, is that Curran belongs to the Dacres family, and there is a story that has been passed on from one generation to another of the Dacres family, which is that if someone is about to die, he will get to see the Dacres dog. So as Curran continues to walk, he sees something charging towards him at a supernatural speed. I quote, it is the brown dog of the Dacres, a dog which showed itself always when a Dacres was about to die and leaped on him whenever the doom was violence. The doom was by violence. I unquote. The next minute, he's supine on the ground under the weight of this dog. And then the very next moment, the dog is gone. So he believes that he sees the devil's mastiff or the brown dog of the Dacres. And so he resolves to see Lady Alicia one last time before he dies. Unfortunately, the story is abandoned here and the reader is left to imagine its possible endings. The question that arises after completing this story is that, does Patrick Curran seek revenge or justice? His bargain to pawn his soul to Satan at the desire to seek revenge can be interpreted as an act of revenge, probably because he becomes like his perpetrators. He does not receive poetic justice because he sacrifices himself at the altar of revenge. His pledge to his king and to his country is not rewarded, thereby him seeking viciousness. And the moment he seeks to avenge himself, he dies a moral death, which is why he says, I quote, let the brown dog of the Dacres leap on me the next moment, I care not, I unquote. Thus his moral death leads to his mortality. That is the price he pays. Curran does not seek mercy from the heavens above to have his soul saved. Therefore, we can see that there is an inherent sense in him of the concept of universal justice that manifests as the Indian concept of karmic cycle, that an action has an equal reaction holds true in his case. Thus, Curran seeks both revenge and justice. For Curran, Trikala Drishti works by drishti and telepathy. Of his meeting with the Dacres dog is described as, I quote, Never had Patrick seen any earthly thing master of such a terrible speed. It ran, it galloped, it bounded, for it was a gigantic mastiff. He went on heavily with the ponderous frame of the animal oppressing his breast, its leonine paws on his shoulders, its hot breathing moistening his face. And then there was nothing. That was the most terrible part of it, to have been borne down physically by a semblance, an unearthly hallucination, a thing that was this moment and the next was not. I unquote. Curran's ability to see this unearthly hallucination of a gigantic mastiff is an instance of drishti. As the shadow telepathically picks up on Curran's desire for revenge and promises its delivery that very night, Curran is definitely startled by this shadow's ability to read his mind. Therefore, he questions the shadow, he asks him questions, and one of the replies that the shadow gives him is that I may be the only one who can read your thoughts. Therefore, this is a case of telepathic communication between the shadow and Patrick Curran. It is imperative to observe here that in January and February of 1911, Sri Aurobindo had visions of, I quote, a dog descending the stairs to the terrace not familiar, unquote, and I quote, Varnamaya of a dog brownish yellow, all in the first stage of the perfect condition and in samadhi, I unquote. These experiences clearly were transcribed into the Devil's Mastiff. The next story of deliberation is The Door at Abelard, which is set in the imaginary village of Stradhew. Abelard is the name of an ancient house and family. The events that occur in the Abelard house are narrated in 2 completed chapters. The story was abandoned at the beginning of chapter 3. The events of chapter 1 are as follows. Stephen Abelard lives with his 2 daughters, Isabel and Eloise, in his forefather's house. The Abelard house is cursed because in the last 100 years, no daughter of the family survived her first son's birth. Issuing daughters did not cause any fatalities, but issuing sons did. So Stephen's father, Richard Abelard, left his forefather's house and went and settled down with his wife in a neighboring county and remained there until the death of his wife. That is why Stephen Abelard survived. Now, Stephen Abelard believed himself to be a modern-minded man, which is why he did not believe in the family curse and he returned to his ancestral home where he continued to live with his wife. So his wife gave birth to 2 daughters and she survived, and so did her 2 daughters. But her 3rd child was the first son, and both the son and the mother died soon. But Stephen refused to believe that it was anything paranormal. Instead, he considered her death as a collapse because she was well looked after by him, by attendants, and by a very respectable doctor. So Stephen believed that the curse finally lost its power. So since the daughters of the house seemed protected against this curse, Isabel, that is Stephen's eldest daughter, lives with him with her husband Richard Lancaster. Richard Lancaster is a British and Abelard's neighbor. Isabel's sister Eloise also lives with her husband Armand Sierke at the Abelard house. Now Armand Sierke is a doctor of French and Asian origin. His Armand's grandfather was born of a Maratha Sardar and a French woman. So Armand met Richard Lancaster's brother John Lancaster in Mumbai, and he accompanied him to England where he started his medical practice. He's a doctor. So he started his medical practice and he married Alois and settled down permanently. A month before Isabel's first delivery, Alois and Armand decide to move into the Abelard house so that Armand can better look after the mother, the would-be mother, and the unborn child. Now, unlike Richard, who dislikes the Abelard house, he calls it beastly and he wants to sell it once his father-in-law is dead, Armand is clearly intrigued by its century-old quaintness, especially by a room which is securely locked. This was a room where one of Stephen's ancestors was murdered. She was Bertha Abelard. On the second day of his stay, Armand notices a difference in Richard, who looks, I quote, as an animal might look when it is aware of some hidden enemy hunting it. I unquote. That night, he is awakened twice by the sound of the door of his room opening and closing. But when he looks in the darkness, he sees no one. So what he does is he turns on the lamp and he goes and closes the door of his room. And then he realizes that the adjacent room is also, the door of the adjacent room is also open. So he enters the room and he realizes that that is the room of Bertha Abelard, where she was murdered. So the room is described as, I quote, a wide balcony walled in so as to form a habitable sitting or sleeping room in summer. For a bare iron bedstead occupied the width of the room near the wall. An old armchair with faded and tarnished cushions stood against the opposite end of the room. I unquote. So on entering the room, he experiences not fear as much as intense horror and hatred. And while he peers at the grounds below, he sees Richard Lancaster looking up at the room. So the next morning, he asks Richard if he slept well, to which Richard says yes, he did. Later in the day, he meets his father-in-law and he asks him if he can visit Bertha's room in the daylight. So when he visits the room, he sees the same thing that he saw the previous night. Here, the events of chapter 1 end. The events of chapter 1 continue as, after a week of his stay at the Abelard house, Armand does not see anything extraordinary in Richard's behavior, but Richard does look distracted and kind of vague. But he does his usual things once in a while, like, he goes reading, he reads, he goes out hunting, riding, and he also plays billiard. So Armand concludes that Richard is a somnambulist, and it is the lack of sleep that made Richard look pale and distracted. 2 nights after coming to this rational conclusion, Armand wakes up in the middle of the night on hearing the door of his room open. Now that night, he was sleeping alone. His wife was sleeping with her sister in the nursery. So he thinks maybe it's Alois who enters the room to check on him. But the next day, when he asks Alois says that she did not come in to check in on him in the middle of the night. So he asks Isabel if where she usually kept her keys. So Isabel says that she usually kept it under her pillow, but that night she kept it in a box which had her toys. So Armand thinks that Richard might be a somnambulist, but he's not omniscient unless he duplicated the key and entered his room and Bertha's room. Visited by Richard, who tells him, I quote, that something in the house is making him see dreams, imaginations, sensations, impulses. Yes, impulses, I unquote. So Armand tells Richard that he should go abroad on a vacation. That very night, Isabel delivers a healthy boy, and 2 days later, Isabel is found dead. When Armand goes to the nursery, he sees a sobbing Richard, but instead of sympathizing with Richard, he starts picking up on forensic clues. After all, he's a doctor. And he realizes that Isabel died an unnatural death. Probably she was murdered. And this method of murder was known only to a select few in the East. John Lancaster, since he visited the East, was aware of this particular method, this particular technique of killing a person by pressing on a spot in the body. So Armand assumes that maybe John Lancaster made Richard Lancaster privy to this technique. So he approaches his father-in-law Stephen and tells him that it is possible that Richard Lancaster is the murderer, but Stephen refuses to believe it. He says that Isabel probably died of a heart attack. That night, later in the night, Richard tells Armand, I quote, "The thing was too strong. Mark my words. The thing will be too strong even for you." I unquote. Shaken as if by a premonition, Armand wakes up in the middle of the night and he rushes to the nursery where he finds Richard bending over the crib with an insane look on his face. And this look is clearly not human. So on seeing Armand, Richard vacates the room laughing an insane laugh. So that Richard does not re-enter, he closes the room from the inside. At 4 in the morning, Stephen knocks on the nursery door and Armand tells him that he would like a word. So before leaving the nursery, Armand wakes up the nurse and tells her to lock the door from inside and keep a strict guard on the child. While walking to Stephen's room, he crosses Richard's room. The door to Richard's room was open, and in the faint light, he sees a womanly apparition. It was slender, this apparition, but Armand does not pause to think through what he saw. So he accompanies his father-in-law to his room and they have a conversation for half an hour. Half an hour later, the nurse comes running and tells him that the infant is dead. And she says that probably it is her fault because she did not close the door to the room. She also tells him that she felt a womanly presence in the room and it wasn't Alois, because she had to wake up Alois after she found out that the infant was dead. So immediately the thought that strikes Armand is that it might be the womanly apparition. So later in the day, of course, a distraught Richard is met by Stephen, who tells Richard that he need not stay home for the funeral. Instead, he can leave as soon as he can, for his travel. But later in the evening, that very same day, Armand is informed by a groom that Richard Lancaster is dead. Clearly, Armand Sierke was ineffective at preventing 2 murders in the Abelard house. So the question arises is he Richard's accomplice? Because he was not compelled by a sense of moral obligation to tell either of the Abelard family members that Richard probably did suffer from some sort of mental challenge. So Armand is a medical man and he continues to dismiss paranormal activities in the Abelard house. Instead, he seeks logical answers to Richard's fears and ravings. He trusts his senses to diagnose his brother-in-law. And yet, those very senses trick him into uh, believing and seeing a slender apparition in Richard's room. So he arrives at the conclusion that Richard is the perpetrator. He does not believe that there are paranormal activities happening, and that probably it is the ghost of Bertha Abelard who is doing these things, or who did these things through Richard. So Armand's disbelief in his brother-in-law's accusation of being hunted by a thing may appear to reverse in the future, because Richard warns Armand, I quote, Armand, you knew, but it was not I. God is my witness. I am not guilty of murder. I can say no more, but in mercy to Alois, look to yourself. I unquote. This note suggests that Armand may become a murderer just like Richard. Richard's note for Armand confirms that Richard did have Pasit Trikaladrishti, attesting the futuristic death of Alois and possibly her son by by Armand, and Armand being incapable of proving his innocence, just like Richard found it difficult to prove his innocence. Now, Lancaster's foresight of Armand's future has its basis in Sri Aurobindo's experience on February 11, 1911. I quote, confirmation of former cognition that Moni, although apparently unconcerned, had really a touch in the prana about his brother's death, confirmed by his statement about dreams and weeping, I unquote. Now we'll move on to the next story, The Phantom Hour, which is set in London. The characters include Sturge Maynard, his sister Lady Imogen, Rene Beauregard, and a stranger. It's a foggy evening, and Maynard is reading a book that seems unintelligible to him, for the writer was a mystic medieval in epoch and temperament, and he was dealing with psychological fancies that the modern world long discarded. Now, while reading the book, Maynard remembers that as a child he was often subjected to white-lit lightnings around his head. Wondering if he could experience one of these as an adult, he looks out of the window and focuses on the fog that is outside the window. And he immediately sees violet flashes in the fog. And from this fog, a silhouette emerges, that of a clock. This clock looks strangely familiar, and upon turning his head, he sees that this phantasmal clock looks similar to the clock that he has on the mantelpiece. But he suffers a shock because the real clock, his clock on the mantelpiece, shows 5 p.m., whereas the phantasmal clock shows 8 p.m., which is the phantom hour. Now he considers it a hallucination and continues to read. After some time, at the completion of a particularly mystic page, the clock chimes the phantom hour 8 again. He waits for it to chime a third time, and the third time, the chiming is accompanied by a woman's voice and a distant gunshot. So without further delay, he fetches his gun and his keys, and he walks out into the dark. He reasons that his sister is safe, but is Renee. So he immediately heads towards her house, and he finds her looking extremely pale and distracted. She tells him that he has to leave immediately, but he should come have dinner at her place at 8 o'clock that very evening. So to pass time, and also of course he's a little worried about his sister, so he goes to meet Lady Imogen, and at 10 to 8, his sister gets up to dress for dinner, which reminds him that he has to immediately rush to Renee's house. And on opening the door of the drawing room, he sees a stranger with a gun in his hand, threatening Renee for cheating on him. So as the stranger lifts his gun to shoot Renee, Maynard pulls the trigger of his gun and kills the stranger. So, with Renee's help and her housemates, they dispose of the body on the road. The story ends here. It is crucial to analyze Maynard's state of mind. When he hears the stranger accusing Renee of being unfaithful to him, Maynard gives her the benefit of doubt and does not judge her morally, and he comes to her rescue. This might raise certain doubts in the reader's mind as to the role of the mind, since its primary function is to distinguish between right and wrong. By this simple logic, if the stranger is wrong to want to kill Renee, Maynard is twice more wrong for murdering the stranger. But Maynard's love gives life to Renee, and the stranger's love seeks revenge. And it is here that emotion not only trumps logic, but love trumps hatred, because love is supposed to forgive. Its law is to embrace and include, whereas the law of hatred and logic is to exclude and deduct. In Maynard's case, Trikaladrishti works by Drishti, Shruti, Smriti, by dwelling in concentration on the object, by using as a means some external sign or science. So, as a young boy, Maynard was often subjected to violet lightnings. And according to a German mystic whom Maynard was reading, so the German mystic says, I quote, "It is a common experience with seers in intense moments of rapid cerebration to see their heads, often their whole surroundings besieged by a brilliant atmosphere, coruscating with violet lightnings," unquote. So an instance of Trikaladrishti working in Maynard is by Smriti, which is him trying to experience, remembering his earlier experiences of seeing the violet lightnings and wanting to experience those violet lightnings as an adult. So he looks out the window to focus on the fog, and from the fog, and in the fog he sees violet lightnings. And from the fog, a clock emerges, the silhouette of a clock emerges. It's a phantasmal clock, of course. So this is an instance of Trikaladrishti working in him by Drishti. The fog represents dwelling in concentration on the object, and the phantasmal clock is a means of some external sign indicating Renee's murder at 8 p.m. that evening. Of course, Maynard considers it a hallucination, and he randomly turns a page in the book which reads, I quote, "For the gods immortal wander always over the earth and come unguessed to the dwellings of mortals. But rare is the eye that can look on them, and rarer the mind that can distinguish the disguise from the deity," I unquote. At the completion of these lines, the physical page reappears and the clock chimes 8 p.m. The disappearance and reappearance of the physical page is another instance of some external sign indicating Renee's death at the phantom hour, that is 8 p.m. And of course, the third time, the chiming is accompanied by a woman's voice and a distant gunshot. Now, both signify Shruti, because Maynard is not sitting near them. He's at a long distance, and yet he hears those sounds. It must be pointed out here that on January 28, 1911, Sri Aurobindo saw the time by the watch in the sitting room to be 2:40. I quote, "Ideally cognized the time by my watch to be 2:43, verified exact to the minute. A little later, after a chase of the opposite house dog, having lost the intellectual idea of the time, I ideally cognized it to be just 2:50, verified exact to the second. I unquote. On February 14, 1911, he saw, I quote, the face of a watch, Chaya and Chayagyan, pointing to 10:30, 8:25, and 7:20, I unquote. These experiences of ideal cognitions and prophecy were given form in the phantom hour. Because Sturge Maynard is able to save Rene, he clearly possesses the dynamic Trikaladrishti. And having said that, the Siddhi of Trikaladrishti falls under the Chatushtaya of Vijnana or knowledge, which marks an evolution of Sri Aurobindo's consciousness through the practice of yoga. As he observes, I quote, yogic or occult powers are no more supernatural or incredible than is supernatural or incredible the power to write a great poem or compose great music. Few people can do it as things are, not even 1 in a million. That is why you got the poetic power as soon as you began yoga. Yoga force made the passage clear. It is the same with yogic consciousness and its powers. The thing is to get the passage clear, for they are already there within you. I unquote. The Devil's Mastiff, the Door at Abelard, the Phantom Hour, and the Golden Bird exemplify Sri Aurobindo's yoga force, making the passage clear between the outer mind and something in his inner being. For as he says, they are already within us, him, and everyone else. A little bit of his occult world and powers is therefore made known to us through these stories and their characters. For as he said, no two people's occult worlds are the same. These stories are therefore miniature samples of Sri Aurobindo's Siddhi of Trikaladrishti, that is, from possessing passive Trikaladrishti to mastering dynamic Trikaladrishti. The deliberate use of the occult or paranormal in the collection called Occult Idols certifies Sri Aurobindo's observation of human life and nature as a yogi with an expansive and comprehensive view of life behind its phenomenal routine of causality. Curran and Maynard are depicted as believing in the paranormal. Curran is not scared to die, and Maynard remains calm in the face of Rene's death, future death, that is. Both are portrayed as calm. Unlike Curran and Maynard, Sir Kay does not believe in the paranormal activities that go on in the Abelard house, and he restricts their workings to nervous disorder as experienced by Richard Lancaster. So Sir Kay inspects incidents through calm reasoning and medical diagnosis to analyze Richard's unusual behavior. And every time there is a paranormal activity, he's not afraid and he does not rush to any conclusion. It is only after Isabel's death that he first approaches Stephen and tells him about his suspicion that Richard might be the murderer. So through this collection, completed between 1910 to 1912, Sri Aurobindo the storyteller had already engaged with the paranormal world through yoga, where cause and effect cannot be empirically tested. Now coming to Jagannatha Rath, which was penned in Bengali in 1918. The setting of Jagannatha Rath is the arena of human collectivity, or as I quote, the path heaped with numerous pleasures, pulled by the mature and incomplete resolutions of the intellect, and the old and new dull urges of the lower nature, I unquote. Unity, freedom, knowledge, and power are the four wheels of the three chariots. The three chariots represent the three egos that govern the human nature: Sattvic ego, Rajasic ego, and Tamasic ego. The Sattvic ego is exemplified by the beautiful exterior of the first chariot. I quote, "It is polished, shining clean and comfortable, fashioned by skilled artisans, drawn by strong, well-trained horses." Unquote. Unfortunately, the chariot cannot rise up even though it goes around the temple. to reach the temple, one has to climb down from the chariot and go by foot. The Rajasic ego is epitomized by the speed of the second chariot. As it rushes forward, I quote, restless and tireless at a breakneck speed, roaring through the storm of dust and shattering the street beneath it, I unquote. It crushes those who trespass its path, and everyone in the vicinity is in danger. It gets into frequent accidents because it goes at a super fast speed, and it does not stop even if it meets with an accident. There is much noise in its rush, but there is no fixed destination, and yet it moves on, rushes on as if the destination is near. Sri Aurobindo says that the West rides in such a chariot. The Tamasic ego is illustrated by the third chariot. It is ancient and dirty. It is slow as a tortoise because it is pulled by partially starved bullocks, and it trudges along narrow rural roads. The charioteer is, I quote, a lazy, blind, pot-bellied, decrepit man in shabby clothes who is basking in the lazy and distorted memories of bygone days, unquote. So the charioteer consults his almanac instead of riding with science, and it is beyond his intellect to recognize or accept that his vehicle cannot compete with modern modes of transportation, and it is time to abandon it. The Tamasic ego is the seat of the deflated. It cannot reach the divine, but only the void of the Brahman. Neither of these chariots, according to Sri Aurobindo, makes for a perfect instrument for the divine. But if one were to choose, one would choose the Sattvic. In order to realize the divine, Sri Aurobindo says that a new chariot has to be built based on the ideals of the commune. The first three chariots were built on the ideals of the society, because the society is, I quote, created by human intellect or by the play of the impure life impulses of nature, and therefore, unquote, it is built on division. Whereas the commune is founded on the ideals of spirituality, where work has a fixed destination called the divine. It is not interspersed with rest and doubt, but reinforced by the ideal of being the divine's model instrument and doing his bidding. By 1918, when Jagannatha Rath was penned in Bengali, Sri Aurobindo had already mastered certain siddhis, namely, I quote, a high revelatory inspirational ideality, the physical ananda, Ishvara as the delight, rasa in the flood of the being, the light of knowledge in the sun and mentality, the word and the thought, tapas. This led to the perception and sense of all substance of matter and consciousness, quality, force, thought, action, etc. as the Ishvara. Formerly, these perceptions were of separate things, tattvas or elements, and temporary, though often of long duration. But now it is global, integral, and steadfast, unquote. So Jagannatha Rath can be interpreted as the literary outcome of Sri Aurobindo's unified and universal vision and experience of the Brahma Chatushtaya in the perception and sense of all things as a conscious body of the Purushottama. This is why he observed that neither of the three earlier mentioned chariots, namely Sattvic ego, Rajasic ego, and Tamasic ego, made for a perfect instrument of the divine. And to realize the divine, a new chariot has to be built based on the ideals of the commune as the conscious body of the Purushottama. Sri Aurobindo's short stories exclude moral lessons, unlike the Mothers. His were meant for adults, and Mothers were and are meant for children. Her stories have the element of allegory, thereby imparting a moral lesson. Sri Aurobindo defines allegory as ideas in imaged form. The Mother adopted a narrative style with the element of dialogue to teach young minds valuable life lessons. With the use of personal and collective pronouns, she helped to develop in young minds a sense of the collective and their role in shaping the future. For example, in the short story The Path of Later On, the moral lesson is included at the very beginning of the short story. In fact, right under the title of the short story, I quote, "The path of later on and the road of tomorrow lead only to the castle of nothing at all." I unquote. And similarly, in the short story A Leader, one of the moral lessons imparted is, I quote, "Violence is never a good way to bring victory to a cause such as yours. How can you hope to win justice with injustice, harmony with hatred?" I unquote. But in the collection of occult idols, we see that Patrick Curran seems to rejoice at the thought of the promised murder of Colonel Lee Walter. Sturge Maynard commits murder, and Richard Lancaster is possibly a murderer. So Sri Aurobindo neither glorifies the murderous act nor promotes it. He speaks of it as an observer, as a yogi. But the mother speaks of violence, hatred, jealousy, procrastination, injustice, and various other vices as someone deeply involved in the development of a young mind. Therefore, hers is a hand of firm guidance. To conclude, to enjoy Sri Aurobindo's short stories, the reader must impose on himself or herself the Coleridgean willing suspension of disbelief. Sri Aurobindo did so in a far more realized manner as a yogi who looks, I quote, at life itself without being involved in it or having any reaction, I unquote, thereby experiencing the occult and spiritual as planes of consciousness or existence that might not be empirically proven, but definitely speculatively affirmed as true and real. Thank you.